Well, grace and peace be with you this morning. You may not know about me, but I am a big Bob Dylan fan. Anyone else like Bob Dylan? Yeah, I thought you would, Ben. That's right. Yep. Bob Dylan's great. And one of my favorite Bob Dylan songs is Forever Young, the slow version of it. And it starts like this. May God bless and keep you always. May your wishes all come true. May you always do for others and let others do for you. May you build a ladder to the stars and climb on every rung. May you stay forever young. I love that song. It's one of the songs that I sing over and over again in the middle of the night while I'm trying to get Oliver to go to sleep. But I started to think about it the other night as I was repeating it, that verse over and over again. There's one phrase in there that seems kind of strange to me. May you always do for others and let others do for you. It's not a sentiment that we hear too often, is it? It's not one that I hear. Because letting others do for you, isn't that being a moocher? You've got to work for ourselves, right? If you just let other people do for you, that means that you're lazy, that you're weak. That's what we hear and think a lot of the time. And in the church, we focus a lot on taking care of one another, as we should, because that's what Jesus taught. That's how Jesus lived. Love one another. Love your neighbor. Take care of the least of these. Extend grace. And we may not always do a good job of actually doing that, but we at least know that's what we're supposed to be doing, sending out love, extending grace in the world. But here's the thing. Bob Dylan was right. Grace goes both ways. It's grace in and grace out. Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. You don't always remember that second part of it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Because if you don't love yourself, it's hard to love your neighbor. We can't actually love God and love one another if we're unable to accept love from God and love from one another. So Bob Dylan was onto something. May you always do for others and let others do for you. But the reality is, I think we find it hard to accept grace. Sometimes we find it hard to accept that love and help from God and from one another. To accept the fact that we can't do it all on our own. We need help from God, and often God works through other people, so we need each other too. But that's difficult to accept sometimes. Which takes us to the scene about Abraham from our Genesis reading. And this story from Genesis, it is a story of extravagant grace. You'll hear people say, oh, that God of the Old Testament, that God is all judgment and no mercy, but then the New Testament, it's so much better, all grace there. But that's simply not true. Yes, there are difficult passages in the Old Testament. There are also some difficult passages in the New Testament, but it's the same God throughout, and there is grace and mercy from beginning to end of the Bible, all the way through it. And this is one of those stories of mercy and grace. Of course, God makes that promise to Abraham. The promise that, Abraham, you're going to have children. You're going to have so many descendants. They're going to be as numerous as the stars in the sky. And then your descendants, they're going to become this great nation. And I will bless you. I will bless your descendants so that you will be a blessing for the world. And at the time, that promise would have seemed pretty absurd. Because Abraham is a poor choice of a person because he and Sarah are way too old. They're way past childbearing years and they don't have any children. But that's the promise. And there's a funny part in our passage today. If you have to really pay attention to see it, but I think there's something that makes me chuckle here. See, we're told that Abraham believed God. And we're told that a lot. Abraham is this man of belief and faith. But then we find out that Abraham's belief isn't that unflinching and certain as we thought. Abraham believes God's promise, but then Abraham is also skeptical. 2 verses after we hear from the narrator, Abraham believed God, God credited righteousness, and then Abraham says, but God, how am I to know that I shall possess the land that you promised? Like, Abraham, I thought you believed. Take it on faith. Because Abraham does believe, and he also has doubts, which is important for us to remember. That just because we trust in God, just because we have faith, doesn't mean we won't be skeptical. It doesn't mean we won't have doubts, and that's okay. That doesn't stop us from being people of faith, people of the promise, just like Abraham. So Abraham asked God for this assurance, and God gives it to him. God and Abraham make this covenant, this arrangement, this contract between them in the way that you would in the ancient world. And this scene, if you were paying attention, is very strange and barbaric to us, isn't it? On God's order, Abraham kills a bunch of animals and he cuts their bodies in half and puts them on either side of the path. I noticed, Tim, that you put all the pictures of the animals, but you didn't have them all mangled up there. Why didn't you? That's part of the story. Why didn't you have all the bloody corpses up there? Because I couldn't find any. You tried. And we thank you. Yes, we thank you for that. On behalf of our children, we thank you. But that's the scene. That's what you would do. And it would have been much cleaner, much nicer to animals just to sign something and have it notarized, wouldn't it? Why not do that? Well, first of all, because there were no notaries. But also in the ancient world, this is how you did things. You cut a contract. And you know why? Because before we had this criminal justice system that you could really count on to enforce laws and enforce contracts, you had to go on your word. Your word and your honor, it meant everything in the ancient world, especially in the Middle East. And so your word and honor was sometimes the only thing that you could trust in one another. So you would make these kind of extravagant promises to one another. And when you cut a covenant, after you had this bloody scene, both parties would walk through the corpses of the animals. In effect saying, as I walk through it, if I break my part of the bargain, if I don't keep it up, then may what happened to these animals happen to me. And then as I watch you go through it, I say, and if you don't keep up your part of the bargain, I'm going to make sure that what happened to these animals happens to you. And that's how it worked. And so Abraham sets the scene for this covenant like you would do, and he cuts up the animals and puts them on either side. But then what does God do? God puts Abraham to sleep. And then this smoking fire pot and this flaming torch go through it, and they both stand for God. Often in the Bible, just like in the wilderness, when the people of Israel are following a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, that fire stands for God. So God, in effect, by this flaming fire pot and this torch, goes through it twice. It's only God that walks through these corpses. God makes the promise, and it has nothing to do with Abraham's faithfulness, which is good news for us, because that promise is also to all of Abraham's descendants, to all of us. God promises that I will be faithful even when you are not. I will continue to bless you. I will stay with you. I will not abandon you. And even if you break the covenant, don't keep up your end of the bargain, which I know you will. You won't always do it. I will still be faithful. And if anyone has to die because this covenant is broken, it'll be me. And think about it. If we read the crucifixion in light of this story, that's what happens. Eventually, that covenant plays itself out. God takes on flesh in the person of Jesus, and then God dies because human beings aren't keeping up our end of the bargain. We aren't being the blessing for the world that we were meant to be. And then in our gospel reading today, as Jesus is going closer and closer to Jerusalem, and he knows what's going to happen. He knows that as you go into Jerusalem, that's when everything's going to come to a head, and he's going to die. And so Jesus says this, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. But this lament for Jerusalem, don't just hear it as something that was meant for people in the distant past or for other people. It's also meant for us. These words are for us. People of God, you were supposed to be different. You were supposed to be a light to the world. You were supposed to be a blessing for the world, but all too often, instead of following that call of Jesus, being gathered together by Jesus, we just go our own way and follow our own paths. But here's the good news of that promise back to Abraham. Despite our failures again and again, God keeps the promise no matter what. God refuses to give up on us no matter what, and that's what grace is. God's grace is unearned, unconditional, and unending. That's the radical grace of God. God refuses to give up on us no matter what. And that grace sounds good. But I think in reality, it's hard for us to accept that kind of radical grace. When we were looking through that Adam Hamilton study on half-truths, one of those half-truths in the second week was, God helps those who help themselves. And this is a phrase, like all those half-truths, that a lot of Christians say, even though it's found nowhere in the Bible. And you have probably heard it. You might have even said it before. And that's okay, because there is a sense in which this phrase is true. But there's also a sense that God helps those who help themselves is not true. It is not the whole truth, so it can be damaging, that half-truth. Here's what's true about it. We can't just wait around and pray, hoping for God to do everything for us. We have our part to play in life. We have our part to play in the world. That's often what people mean by this phrase. But what's not true is that God only helps those who help themselves. Sometimes we can't help ourselves, and sometimes other people can't help themselves. We have to rely on God, and since God chooses to work through people, we often have to rely on one another. The good news is that while we have our part to play, God even helps those who can't help themselves. And I bring all this up because I thought that this half-truth was a particularly difficult one, because I think we like it. That idea that God just helps those who help themselves. Because that's the kind of grace that we are comfortable with. A grace that's provisional. A grace that only goes so far. We're okay with extending grace as long as it meets certain conditions, as long as that grace goes for an appropriate amount of time, but then at some point we think that grace has got to cut off for other people and for us. We're not naturally comfortable with a grace that's unearned, unconditional, and unending. We expect it to end. Just like Peter asked Jesus, Lord, how many times do I have to forgive somebody? What about 7? 7 seems like a pretty generous number, right? Jesus says, no, Peter, if you have to pick a number, don't pick 7, pick 70 times 7, which is a way of saying you never stop forgiving. Why? What are we supposed to be doing as people of God? Showing God's grace. And God's grace does not end. It never runs out. If God's patience and grace could run out, it would have run out a long time ago. Human beings have been doing terrible and stupid things to one another for a very long time, haven't we? And God still is with us. God has not given up on us. But can we accept it? Can we accept that grace that is truly unlimited? Let's go back to Bob Dylan. May you always do for others and let others do for you. It's the way it works. Grace in and grace out. We have received God's grace. Whether you ask for it or not, whether you want it or not, you have received God's grace. And we are called to extend that grace. Grace in and grace out. But here's the other thing. We are also called to extend that grace to ourselves. You need God's grace too. I haven't been in ministry that long, but I can't count the number of times that I've heard someone say, I just don't know if I'm doing enough. I don't know if I'm doing enough for God. And I get it. I felt that way. I have asked that question of myself. I don't know if I'm doing enough. But hear me, and know this, that sometimes when you feel convicted, when you feel that tug on your heart, that may be God calling you to do something, to do some new kind of way of extending grace. But listen to me, stop worrying if you're doing enough. If you're trying to do enough to earn God's grace, you're going to fail. It'll never happen. That's not how grace works. We just can't do it. Grace is just a gift. Accept it and extend it. That's all there is to it. Grace is a gift. Accept it and extend it. So may grace and peace be with you. Amen.